Hey, thanks for joining us for Next Up. This is where we talk to community leaders about what's going on in St. Louis and around the world. And this week, it seems like everybody in the country is talking about police and possible police reform. And so we thought we'd welcome the executive director of Forward Through Ferguson, Dwight IV, to return to our program. He kindly agreed to do that. Mr. Dwight, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Doing well. Good to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. Greg Willard, professor of law at St. Louis University, is also on the dais for the first time. Professor, thank you.
Good to be with you, Charlie.
And I'll just throw out the question, where are we in policing right now? And if you had your druthers, what changes would be made? Let's start with you, Professor Willard.
Charlie, I think it's important that we take a pause and step back and look at it briefly in a historical context. Take our viewers back to 1600 in Virginia. And it is a sad chapter, but it is a chapter of all of us. And it began our country's journey with slavery. And you take that for 2.5 centuries to the Civil War in 1865. And there was a flicker, Charlie, where maybe we were turning the corner. Unfortunately, Reconstruction lasted all of 10 years. And with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise with the presidential election in 1876, with it, poof, went Reconstruction. So we then suffered with Jim Crow laws and the horrific state-sanctioned segregation for decades and decades. The mid-60s, we had the civil rights legislation, and now we find ourselves early in the 21st century. So we've got a history of 4 centuries that, if nothing else, shows us that we as a society and the policing portion of that society, we got a lot of work to do, Charlie. And I think the events in Minneapolis the last few weeks have just reminded us of the moment, but I think we need to understand the historical context that emphasizes that point. We got a lot of work to do.
Mr. David?
Yeah, I really appreciate that grounding in history, because we can only understand where we are now if we know where we've been. And so many of those roots that were just mentioned about the founding of policing, as well as those initial compromises and power dynamics that were created on who was considered a full human being within the United States of America, still remain at the root of where we are today. And so we remain in a point of crisis. For our entire history, there's been resistance to push for us to have a public safety system that actually centers the public safety of all of our residents. And we're at a moment now where it's reaching another peak of work. And I'm really, really incredibly heartened by the thousands of people who are doing work in the streets, in the academy, in government, in a variety of systems to even get this conviction. But this conviction is not the goal. This is one small step, a little bit of accountability that actually is not really what we should be seeking. I think if I'm thinking about where we should be looking, it's at completely restructuring how we think about public safety and reducing a lot of the ways that the police are empowered to actually put a lot of harm onto communities, especially Black communities in St. Louis and the United States.
Alvin?
Well, David, I'll follow up on that. Name me a couple of those. Okay, for the police. And I don't think that has ever been the case. And I have trouble condemning every man and woman who is a police officer, because I think the overwhelming majority of them mean no harm to anyone.
Well, I think that's the really dangerous thing about systemic racism, is it actually doesn't take individuals who have ill will for there to be racist outcomes and a lot of state violence that occurs. And I mean, looking even recently, there are many cases in St. Louis. We actually have the highest rating of police killings of civilians in the country in SLMPD, in the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, and quite a history of police enacting violence on communities. And I think when we focus in on individuals, whether the individual cop is good or bad, we actually lose sight of the forest for the trees. And actually what we should be thinking about is, how are we even structuring the creation of public safety? Police are not trained to actually meet community needs to create safety, and are actually trained more as paramilitary organizations and trained to enact force, when actually the root causes of crime are the things that anybody needs in order to thrive and have well-being. So I do think it's beyond just changing use of force statutes. I think it's actually restructuring and moving out some of the functions that we currently have as police and putting them into more appropriate professionals that can respond to community members.
Ray?
Well, after the verdict, which most of us, I think, was an example of racial justice, but by no means, as you point out, an end. Within 24 hours, there were 3 video shootings, officer-involved shootings, as they call them, of African Americans, that all of which are having the same reaction. Meanwhile, in Missouri and in many other states, there's all kinds of legislation that Republican legislation that would essentially criminalize protests, on highways and all the stuff. Everything is designed to criminalize these Black Lives Matter protests. So I guess my question is, do you have hope that in Missouri, places like Missouri, this is going to actually move the needle, or is it just going to be one more thing we're fighting about?
Well, I'll take that initially, Ray, and I think perhaps it will move the needle, but I would like to echo the comments a moment ago. We need to kind of get over ourselves in this respect. I think, at least in the eyes of many, and I would include myself among them, we have systemic racism in this country. Period, full stop. Now, that does not mean that our neighbors are racists. It means that we as a country have a history, as I was just speaking a moment ago, of over 400 years of some of the worst examples of racism in the history of the world. Now, if we can just kind of get over that and say, okay, we have systemic racism, it doesn't mean that everyone is a racist, but we have systemic racism and we need to get busy to fix it. And so when you point out these statutes here, I do think that's a flicker on the dial. I think we need much more fundamental changes, and whether it's in policing, in housing, in finance, but we need as a society, we need as a body politic, Ray, to move forward and recognize, not condemn it and not to turn a blind eye to it, but recognize our history and recognize where that has left us in the 21st century. And sure, there may be a policy change with this police department there or here that will help, but we need to think big, Ray. Think very, very big.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We actually, at Fort Ferguson, have studied policy changes that have happened locally in police departments in the 6 or so years since the murder of Michael Brown and the Ferguson uprising. And we found that out of those reforms that the Ferguson Commission offered up to the region, very, very few had been implemented. And even those that were implemented, because of the way that the system is set up, how we apportion resources, the way that police are trained, the ways that they're set up to often act as criminalizers of poverty crimes, actually means that those small reforms around the edges haven't really changed the lived experience of people of color in the region. And it's with that kind of reflection and learning that we see, like Professor Wood was saying, we've got to go deeper. It's a more fundamental restructuring that's needed in our region.
Bill?
If I could be forward-looking here for a moment, and the specifics, like this seems like a moment in time, nationally and locally, not only in Minneapolis with that verdict, but Tashara Jones becoming the mayor. The Board of Aldermen is more progressive. If you could look forward a year, what is something specific that you would like to see so you could say, there is a sign of progress? Either of you.
Absolutely. I think there are a number of things. And I think this often it feels like what could public safety look like with police playing a much smaller role can seem something fanciful, but I think the answers and the tangible ways that can look in practice actually exist today. So one way that I would look at it is our health and human services budgets in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. Right now, both of those budgets are actually less than just the police overtime budgets. So in the city of St. Louis, 0.02% of the general fund goes to health and human services for our residents, compared to over 40% of the general fund going to policing and other forms of incarceration. So it would look like a shifting of those priorities because budgets are values documents. Another way that we could know that we've been successful is that some of these responses, these community needs, actually get spun off to other professionals. So when we're thinking about traffic stops, nonviolent traffic stops, when we're thinking about response to drug-related issues and mental health and other crises where often police can actually escalate a situation, or we've heard from residents they're likely not to call police when an incident occurs because they're afraid of some of the ramifications or possible violence. It would look like us actually having independent services that would be those first responders for those set of community needs.
Derek Chauvin.
Go ahead, Wendy.
I'm sorry, Professor. Go right ahead.
Well, I would quickly add, Bill, in terms of looking out one year on the window. Here's a thought. It's not up to President Biden and the leaders in Congress necessarily to be the only source of a solution. Think about this for a moment. What if a group of governors got together? Because our founders contemplated that the states would be sort of the laboratories for social policy. What if several governors of the states got together and they collectively began to come up with possible solutions and possible programs along the lines we've been talking about this evening? I think that could be a tremendous catalyst rather than all eyes turning to Washington and that those folks can fix our problems. But I would just suggest to you, Bill, that if on a state level, collectively, a group of governors and state governments, I think, could formulate some really, really possible solutions.
Thank you.
One of the components that was deemed inadmissible in the trial of Derek Chauvin was a 2017 incident, I believe, in which he used compression or pressure on a 14-year-old to the point where the young man passed out. And what I can't understand, and I'm hoping that Mr. Dwight and Professor Willard, if you can explain to me, he had 18 complaints. 3 or 4 of those were formalized complaints. How do will we now do a better job of weeding out these police officers who, in the words of Professor Willard earlier this week, are such an insult to the law enforcement officers who do their job commendably on a daily basis? David, we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring up a really important point about the lack of accountability that exists and how these behaviors are often tolerated by police departments and often protected, sometimes by police unions, but also other officers within the force. Some of you may have seen on social media, they were recirculating the press release that was first put out after the murder of George Floyd, which completely misrepresented what had happened to take accountability away from the officer for what he had done. And I think we don't even have to look to other states for those kind of practices. It actually happens here in St. Louis and across the state of Missouri, where records for misconduct and violence that officers perpetrate are not actually public record and can be incredibly difficult to access. And we don't have a public-facing use of force database so that the public can see the trends and hold our departments accountable. This is also something that's sometimes called the Muni Shuffle, where these records of misconduct by officers are supposed to be reported up to the peace officers standards and training body at the state level. And then that's supposed to bar them from being able to move to other departments. But we routinely find out that a lack of accountability, a lack of diligence on the part of police departments mean that accountability doesn't exist. And so I would say that accountability has to be increased, but the way to do it transformatively is to actually involve more community voice in how we set our public safety and to involve more civilians in oversight roles over how we do public safety.
Wendy, I would I'll give you two answers. First is a sort of a textbook or a law school classroom answer, and then the second one, hearkening back to my earlier comment. The reason very often that those types of evidentiary items are not admissible is there generally are evidentiary restrictions on prior bad acts. And the rules are rather complex, but that there's a reluctance on the courts to allow prior bad acts to come into evidence. Now, having said that, think about this for a moment, back similar to my colloquy with Bill. What if some states got together and among other pieces of the mosaic tile to find solutions, they began to develop a slightly different rules of evidence in the conduct of criminal trials involving police misconduct. And the rules of evidence governing police misconduct, maybe they are slightly different to include the prior bad acts, the things David was just talking about. There's no reason that rules of evidence cannot be adjusted to get at the root from the legal process standpoint of these problems. Because at the end of the day, we can all agree on two things. The sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow, and the men and women of law enforcement who are out there doing the job right now to protect us, they need our support. But they also need those who bring ill to the badge. They need the court system and society to deal with those swiftly and fairly. And it seems to me that you've identified a problem, Wendy, restrictions on prior bad act testimony in a criminal trial. Well, by golly, maybe some people, certainly a lot smarter than me, could formulate some solutions to make those types of prosecutions a little more open, a little more transparent, and a little more, shall we say, comprehensive, Wendy.
Mr. Dwight, if I could follow up on your thoughts earlier on moving resources maybe from the police to human services. Your organization tweeted something to that effect on April the 12th about an April 13th conference you were holding, which was called Defund the Police. And you talked about taking money from police departments to things like Wi-Fi and rental assistance. But last year, for example, the city of St. Louis had north of 260 homicides. And last summer, police officers were shot at 12 times, 2 of them fatally. I'm wondering, is this really the time that we want to transfer money from the police department, especially when the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department is 150 officers short of a full complement?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and actually a block that comes up for a lot of people when we're thinking about how to transform our public safety system. And so that event was part of this new coalition that's formed between Ford v. Ferguson, Arch City Defenders, Action St. Louis, and the Coalition Against Police Crimes and Repression called Defund, Re-Envision, Transform. And so when we think about violence, which we absolutely have too much of in our community and that cause a huge amount of trauma, we have to remember that part of that violence is also violence that police perpetrate on communities. Like I mentioned, we're one of the top regions in the country for police killings of civilians. And when it comes to violence and solving it, police are not a solution to violence. Police actually come after a violent incident has already occurred. And then on top of that, our clearance rates are some of the lowest in the country when it comes to clearing homicides. And so even if we were to increase the amount of police, it still actually wouldn't solve for the root causes of violence because it's its approach afterwards. The things that cause increased violence that's happened in some urban regions across the country has been COVID. The COVID pandemic has led to an increase of murders in a variety of localities. And that's because of the ways that it's squeezed people's access to living incomes, the ways that it's exacerbated health disparities, the difficulty that has occurred around housing and shortage of affordable and fair housing for people, and a huge rise in the number of evictions. These are the things that both lived experience from community members when we've talked to them, as well as the research show are the things that actually lead to higher rates of crime. We've seen increases in the police department budgets, the police department amount of military weaponry, increases in the number of police officers all across the country, but it's actually been shown not to be tied to the amount of crime. And to decreases in crime. So I would argue that why keep trying something that we know is not actually solving for the root causes when we can reinvest in those root causes? The last thing that I'll add there is the Ferguson Commission was created after this incident of a killing of a young unarmed Black man, Michael Brown. In the process after that, they could have just focused on reforms to policing, but actually they came back a year later after engaging 3,000 community members with a whole slew of recommendations that covered wealth building, housing, health, transportation. And that's because fundamentally we knew that those are the things that people need to thrive and that these systems are connected. So I would say we actually can't afford to invest in more police and allow this violence to continue.
I would add to that that similar to my comment a moment ago is I've been frustrated, I guess, as a citizen by so many in the public square getting hung up on the terminology defund the police. And when I was an active lawyer, I handled large multi-billion-dollar corporate bankruptcies. And when people would hear the word bankruptcy, well, this company has filed bankruptcy, and all of the attendant things from that. And I think when people hear defund the police, there's a similar cascade of conclusions and assumptions as to what's going on. Well, in my world, back in the day, we didn't talk about bankruptcy. We talked about restructuring and reorganization. And words have meaning. And so I would hope that those among us who in the public square and otherwise who are coming up with solutions, words have meaning. And I think the sooner we can move the conversation away from this notion of defunding the police and whether it's, in my world, restructuring or reorganized policing, as David has just been pointing out with some of the ideas, that I think that would go a long way to getting us as a body politic centered so that we can come up after 4 centuries, finally, we can come up to deal with the problem of racism and policing.
If I could just jump in, forgive me, David, that's your word, defund. Do you want to use that word?
Yeah, we actually are using that word, but we're pairing it with a variety of other things. The campaign is called Defund, Re-Envision, Transform, very intentionally, but the reality of it is defund is the first step. It has to happen in concert with some other things, but we often talk about the need to break down systems that aren't serving us so that we can reimagine and create new systems in the process. It's not about the demands of the campaign are not to zero out in this year from policing, though I would challenge us to think about a world 20, 25 years from now where we've completely restructured how we think about public safety. But we do think that that's an essential first step to stop investing in things that are creating harm for a lot of community members. And police killings, as horrible and devastating as they are, and it was mentioned earlier, right after the verdict of the Chauvin trial, there were another set of killings of Black people, including a 16-year-old girl, Ma'Khia Bryant. It's really time that we're starting to defund from those systems. Again, the impacts beyond just the actual killing to beatings that happen, to indignities every day, and start to invest in different ways. Why keep investing in things that aren't working?
Alvin?
David, and also to you, Professor. Now, Professor, I'll start with you because I don't know that you're dealing with law students, and maybe you hear this where that one of the reasons I want to become an attorney is to protect people from the police. I hate the police. And David, I would imagine in your job and in your role, you probably talk to young people. When a young person says to you, "I hate the police," what is your response to them?
1 minute to go.
I'm sorry. I would have made this question shorter.
Well, quickly in the classroom, Alvin, I've taught now in the classroom for about 15 years, and there is an increasing focus on the whatever nomenclature we want to use, but in public defender work, in civil rights work, in public policy reform. And we just had an awards ceremony last night, and the student of the year at St. Louis University Law School, that's exactly where that wonderful young woman is headed. And we all should take great pride in it. So I think there's a significant glimmer of hope in that regard, Alvin.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition of Next Up. Thank you very much for your time, Greg Willard, Professor Willard, and David Dwight IV. We sure appreciate the time you've shared with us on 9 PBS.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks very much, Charlie.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll be back next week at this time.